Okay, here's one for Veronica. How does the forum assure industry and academics that intellectual property is protected?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we get that very often. So basically, the issues we address don't force anyone to disclose any information that they're not ready to disclose. So we look at questions that all industry members would be concerned about. For example, the sole idea of biomarker validation or how to standardize definition. When we ask companies, for example, to donate us their placebo arm data, placebo arm are those people who are not getting the active drug. So in the placebo arm, there really should be no proprietary information. But we do realize, of course, that companies may or may not decide to do that. But we basically don't get into that issue by the nature of the discussions we have.
Okay, so I was asked to answer a question. The registry shows a difference in symptoms depending on where participants are located. Please provide more details. So the main analysis we've done is really comparing North America to Europe. And so that's the main two groups we've looked at. A lot of the differences have to do with severity of the liver disease. I think in the US we're seeing more severe participants. That may be because we have perhaps longer wait times for liver transplantation here, so some of the symptoms are related to that. We do, however, also see more itching in particular among the US participants. So the next question is, if you're on multiple registries, how is the data flagged as duplicates? That's a great question. It's not an easy one to answer. It's important to let the group running the registry know if you are involved in another registry. So if there's combination of those registries later, those duplicates can be found. Now, in genetic data, in the genetic studies, we often had, not often, but not infrequently had people contributing to different DNA collections, and that's easier because you can identify duplicates on a genetic basis. But for some of these other registries where we're looking at clinical outcomes, it's a little harder. Sometimes we can compare age and initials, but we unfortunately don't have patient identifiers, so it's a little harder. Next question, can you please talk about any short and or long-term goals of the PSE Partners Grants program, and what are things we as patients can do to help enhance the already successful grants program? Well, I think in terms of the short and long-term goals of the PSE Partners Grants program, a lot of that is really up to PSE Partners and what they ultimately want those goals to be. I think what the Scientific Medical Advisory Committee can do is give advice in terms of what are scientifically sound grant applications and prioritize them based on that. Obviously, we do take into consideration their significance and whether they're going to have an impact on PSE, how relevant they are to PSE. You know, the short-term goals are to get, I guess, a better understanding of PSE. The long-term goal is to get treatments to PSE patients that improve either how they feel or how they live their lives. And what patients can do to enhance the grants program. You know, we've had patients with some background that have ideas and have submitted grants and actually been funded through these grants. So I think if you're a patient, and many PSE patients have advanced degrees, or, you know, it is a smart group. So bringing a patient perspective, new ideas is a great way, I think, to help the grants program, as well as fundraising, of course. Next question is it necessary or possible to update information on the registry? Right now, and Rachel might be able to answer this better, but in terms of the PSE Partners Registry, you can go in and update sort of the status, but we're not collecting, to my knowledge, what we call prospective data. So, for example, if you had another blood test or if your symptoms changed, not necessarily updating those. If you went and had a liver transplant, we'd want to know that. So that is something I think we're looking into and needing to discuss in terms of how to make this not just a one-time collection of data, but how can we update this in a systematic way so that we have as up-to-date data as possible. Next question is, what are other potential biomarkers? So I mentioned the alkaline phosphatase. So that's still a potential biomarker, but I think most of us are less optimistic about that as a biomarker. It may be part of a score that might be developed that would include alkaline phosphatase, bilirubin, other just general blood tests that everyone gets that might help us identify those patients that are at greatest risk. I mentioned the ELF test. I really am impressed with that one. That was studied in a large group, actually 2 different groups in Europe, and has come out to be a reliable indicator. And a recent study using data from the Gilead clinical trial on a medication called simtuzumab showed that the ELF test worked very well. So this was an example of a clinical trial where the drug didn't work, but the data that was collected has been very useful, and that data has been used to show that the ELF test is a pretty good biomarker for some clinical outcomes. The other biomarkers would be imaging. So the FibroScan we talked about. There's a similar test called an MR elastography, which is becoming more available and maybe a little bit better than FibroScan. And believe it or not, a liver biopsy is actually a biomarker, though it's a relatively invasive one. And there's some data on that, but I think given its invasiveness, we're trying to avoid that as being a biomarker. Let me also just say that people are looking at more high-tech kind of biomarkers in terms of metabolites, things called microRNAs, a variety of other things that may not be readily available clinically but might otherwise be good biomarkers. And the last question, how can universities like yours make your voices known to our Congress and specifically our U.S. senators as they make critical legislations? That's a difficult one. So I think universities are not likely to take up the cause of PSE specifically. They do take up the cause for overall biomedical funding, and I think the good news is despite some budget proposals that would slash NIH funding, I think there's sort of bipartisan agreement that NIH funding is vital, that it's not something that would be good to cut back on. So I'm hopeful that we'll see continued NIH funding, though it's still quite tight. I mean, if you look at the funding rate for NIH grants, we're talking about 10% of grants that are submitted being funded. So it's a very competitive environment. So this is where, the grants program from PSE Partners can really help us be more competitive in that environment. I think it's about reaching out to your legislatures from a patient point of view. That's where you're going to have the most impact. Universities are working on their end, as well as physician groups, to help maintain, if not increase, funding for medical research. So I'm told it's time to say goodbye, and it's been great to be able to talk to you, though I wish I could hear and see you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the meeting, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. Take care.
Okay, I have a few quick questions for Veronica. One is, what is the role of pediatrics in the forum?
Again, very, very good question. In many cases, well, first of all, the pediatric drug development plan is special in itself. So for many of these diseases that affect both adults and pediatrics, and especially if the disease course in pediatrics may be different, we actually put together a working group to specifically focus on the pediatric issues, because we'll need the pediatricians and people who also help transition the kids to adulthood. So you have the infants, you have the toddlers, you have the kids, you have the adolescents, then you have the young adults and the adults. And so very often those worlds are quite separated. So we need to find a way to, number one, understand the pediatric natural course of disease. Then to test drugs in children, it has to pass some additional hurdles. And we need to make sure that everybody is on the same page. But again, having more knowledge about the natural course of disease in children will help us decide when it's safe enough to go and test children. But then also really to transition that time between pediatrics and adulthood, what happens in that period of time. And often there's a huge gap there in our knowledge.
All right, then we have two questions on funding.
Okay.
One is, does the PSE Forum collaboration need or take donations for its work? I'm sure you wouldn't mind that. And the other is, would there be any benefit to having patients advocate in a group in Washington with our state reps and senators to ask for NIH financial support for your forum?
Thank you very much. Those are two very wonderful questions. And yes, we are completely self-funded. We're part of UC Berkeley, but we do not get funding from the university. We function as a self-funded unit. We've had funding. A lot of it comes from industry. The companies that are interested in developing drugs are, of course, interested in figuring out what the path is going to be. But we keep going back to the same companies over and over again. We have had money from the NIH for specific projects that they are interested in. Whenever we find a non-industry source of grants, we apply for grants. Sometimes we get them, sometimes we've had grants, for example, from the Gates Foundation in the past. And one thing that we want to do, because the forum is now 20 years old, and NIH was actually a founding member of the forum, because all of the big government agencies were part of when the forum was first established. And so when we have this 20th, I keep saying 20th century, 20th year anniversary event, which will be either very late this year or early in 2018, we will have the NIH there, and we'll have many of the higher level leaders from all of these agencies there. And I think if there was, we want to feature each forum at this event, and if people from the PSE community were there and also talked about the importance of this kind of effort for this rare disease, where you don't have you don't have you have an NIDDK at the NIH, but you don't have an Institute for Rare Diseases in PSE, for example. So I think that would be very nice if there was some response from the community saying this really is helpful to us.
Right. Well, let us know when it is, and I'm sure
Yes.
we have very active people, as you see.
We will
get a
there
group
will be
to come.
lots of, we will blast that out. We just need to get a few more people on board so we can actually do it.
Okay. All right. I will
Thank
let
you.
you all know, and then if some of you will come to Washington or wherever you're going to have it, that would be
Right,
great.
yeah.
And one last question, which I don't know if you can do in a very short time, is can you give an example of what it takes for a drug to move through the various phases? That's kind of a long story.
That I think is very, it's a long story, and I think I would, I'll be here this evening, this afternoon, this evening. I leave tomorrow morning at 6:30. I don't do breakfast, so I won't meet anyone for breakfast before 6:30 for sure, but anytime I'll be here, let me know, we can talk about things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.